Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have two special guests with us. We have Kelly WIllenberg from Kelly WIllenberg and Associates, and we have Geoff Schick from WCG, or as we put it, he is WCG, but no. But I did want to bring them both on because we've had a couple of sessions the last few days over and hopefully a bunch of people have tuned in and we could see that. And there seemed to be a lot of interest around COVID, centralization, decentralization, and is it going to take? And let's before we jump into all of that, Kelly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Kelly WIllenberg. I own Kelly WIllenberg and Associates. I've owned this business for 12 years this coming March. I cannot believe that came out of my mouth. It sounds like a long time. But I work with clients all over the country in clinical research, healthcare compliance, and I do probably, 60% billing compliance.
Jeffrey?
Yes, so I'm Geoff Schick. I'm a consultant with WCG, working with research sites as well. Have been with WCG for about 4 years, 20 years in research administration and consulting, a little bit actually working for Kelly once upon a time. And similar to Kelly, I do a lot of work with research billing compliance as well as research operations for community-based hospitals and integrated healthcare delivery systems.
Very cool. So let's start with a question that we haven't asked that sort of just came up. How has COVID been for billing? I know, Kelly, you said you were invoicing people this week. It's the first week of the new year. I'll start with myself. I have a bunch of overdue bills that I'm going after clients and going, you know what?
Yeah.
I wasn't pushing it because I didn't want that income for 2020. But now it's time to push. And have you been holding off? Because when I have to pay, I try to pay that as quickly as I possibly can because I want that deduction on my taxes. But from a billing perspective, my clients were slower. What was your take, Kelly?
I would say there was a mix. There were some clients that had to be slower because of being, I would say, remote. There were some issues with systems, and you sometimes you put an invoice into one system, and if they're not at the hospital, they couldn't get access through VPN. That was an issue for probably the first 6 months.
Yeah,
I would say there were clients at the end of the year who, toward the end of the year, I'd say November and December, they started asking if I could invoice them for anything that I had because they had money left over because they had to reallocate their budgets because they didn't use money for certain things this year, such as travel and training. I don't know, Geoff, did you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have a lot of direct contact in terms of how our client billing functions. But I do know that there was definitely, obviously in the late spring, summer, there was slowdowns, a lot more discussions between us and our client base in terms of considerations in preparation for and consideration of that things might be slower. Obviously, there was a lot of furloughs, staffing reductions, people being much more highly sensitive to what their expense levels were. And so I know, at least as an organization, we had a lot of discussions to try and make sure that we were continuing to meet the needs of clients and trying to be considerate of that. But I don't know if I don't know how long that continued or if it truly made a significant impact. A lot of the sites I work with after coming out of that trough have been extremely busy since. I mean, research activity levels are picking up tremendously. So that's good.
Which was exactly the interesting part. I feel like everyone, for most other people at least, I've heard of, it slowed down in like March again because everyone was like, well, is COVID going to mean business shuts down? And what they found was it actually picked up for most of us, I think. Most of the people in healthcare. Let's not say most of us, whatever the word us means here. But here's my question for you from a site perspective for Geoff and Kelly, if you have an opinion on this. We know that COVID trials have gone up, but how has that actually affected other studies? Have we seen an uptick and our clients paying? When I say clients, sponsors paying sites.
So again, within the subset of clients that I'm currently supporting and working with, I think it probably goes by therapeutic area. I think there are some areas that have slowed down to a certain degree, maybe more cardiovascular or peripheral vascular type studies, more interventional, since there's been so much impact to the clinical service lines at healthcare facilities around interventional procedures. It's, many have continued to keep a very restricted operating room schedule or interventional suite schedule versus some other areas that are more have always been in the outpatient. So respiratory illness, rheumatoid arthritis, things like that had a blip, but those clinical areas have found a way to continue to see patients, and because of that, there are still investigational products that have to proceed along the path towards approvals. So sponsors have been trying again to get any backlog protocols activated, get all studies that were in process about a year ago at this time and suffered delays, get those reactivated and back on track. And so I would probably think that it's a little bit more specific to specific therapeutic areas, but overall, definitely the rebound is well underway, I would say.
Kelly, is that your experience too?
I agree. I think that there were slowdowns May, June timeframe in certain therapeutic areas. And some of it was due to the fact that sites had their people remote, and some of the studies they couldn't start because it was remote. And then Medicare, made some changes, put in some emergency plans. People kind of flipped to let's go to telehealth today.
Yeah.
And that helped with some of the visit timelines that we had on protocols where we got away from deviations and violations every day. And I think Geoff is right. I think it's starting to slowly pick up again. And I think the sites that did COVID studies, they're sort of now getting a little bit of a breather. It's like, oh, okay, we're coming back from, slam for weeks and weeks trying to get patients on COVID trials.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, is the COVID studies themselves, whether they were expanded access and compassionate use type products, or whether they were, studies that oftentimes were inpatient, really filled a lot of that gap and have been tremendously resource intensive to conduct. So that even if there may not be as many studies activated or as many patients, the workload for staff at the research sites in many cases has really bloomed because any active treatment studies for COVID are extremely resource intensive to conduct.
So let's talk about COVID a second. Do you find that just at one point it seemed like everyone, including Kodak, suddenly said, we're in the business of COVID, which was very bizarre for a second. How did that translate into studies happening at the sites? Did every site suddenly say, we are able to do COVID studies, or did it change? Were only certain people saying we can do COVID? Does that question make sense?
I think some sites said, okay, we're all in, let's do COVID. They didn't bat an eye. They didn't even like pause. And some sites are going back now and evaluating, did they do them correctly? Because I mean, they hit the ground just, running when they did it.
Right.
I think there were a few sites that got in to the COVID trials. I don't know that all of them actually understood what they really were getting into. As
Right.
Geoff just said, those studies were not easy, studies to do. There was a lot of work and a lot of data, and it was quick, and there were deadlines, and I think sites struggled with that.
I completely agree. And I think with some of the larger healthcare systems, multi-state system, integrated systems, I think they made decisions early on of this is a global pandemic. This is a critical juncture in the advancement of science and medicine. We're going to get involved, and we're not going to worry about costs. We're not going to worry about resources. We are going to help find new treatments, new therapies, new opportunities to affect this and shorten and eliminate this pandemic. And I think that made a big difference. And then there were others that absolutely pulled back and took a wait and see attitude and maybe are just now starting to get involved a little bit more. So, and I don't know there was many in between. I think they either jumped in with both feet or stayed out of the pool for 4 or 5 months to see how it evolved before they got involved. That's at least my experience.
But that's kind of weird, though, isn't it? I mean, I totally get a large academic institution saying, we can do COVID trials, no big deal, because we do everything anyways. But if you are a small doctor's office, and Jeffrey, you said you work with those a lot, in those situations, to suddenly go from I do neurology, I do ophthalmology, to suddenly you're doing COVID, that makes no sense. How are you even getting the studies?
Yeah, I'm not sure we had too much of that where they were crossing over, but there were definitely complex studies that because of the nature of the disease, there were a lot of different aspects being studied in terms of how it affected. I mean, what started out as thought is, okay, well, this is a virus that's respiratory, then became, well, it's a virus and maybe it's vascular and maybe it's got neurological effects. And so it branched out to very much multi-specialty type projects. So I think there were, including ophthalmology, there were aspects around certain treatments that had to pull in other specialists to see how the investigational compounds or redirected compounds potentially had side effects or prevention of side effects. And so I think that's where the creep kind of seems out there. But I don't know that there were at least direct-to treatment studies. I'm not sure that there were people that were radically flipping their practice and the patients they were seeing trying to get involved in it. Maybe some that wanted to, but
yeah.
So let's raise the question du jour, which is everyone suddenly going, as you mentioned, everyone said, you know what, Medicare, Medicaid came out and said, we're going to encourage telehealth. We're going to let people do basically treat patients using telehealth. Yesterday's news was Amazon's going big into telehealth. If you follow your stock market, all of your telehealth sort of stocks just went through the roof. The question I have is for both of you. One of the big things that came out of that is we're now in a world where we have decentralized studies. And decentralized studies is the next big thing. It's the hottest thing. And everyone's talking about how the world has changed and everything's everything we did prior to March 2020 is almost out of date. And we're going towards a pure decentralized study process. My question for you is that true? Kelly, ladies.
I think there are going to be changes in how we do trials, long-term changes. I think I've been in this long enough to have known over the past 35, 37 years now that we always thought at some point we were going to go totally remote, totally paperless. And, I honestly thought it wouldn't happen before I retire. But after 30 some years, it kind of happened like that. And, with e-consenting, telehealth, digital health, we got to look at now the access for the patients.
Yeah.
It might actually make it so patients have easier access. We might have more trials opening at sites. It actually could be a very economically good benefit for sites if they're able to open studies that they can open with telehealth and not have to think about, okay, how are we going to do this if the patient has to be here every afternoon at 5 o'clock? Because if I can sit at my desk and do what I need to do for the study, I'm more apt to go on the study than to turn it down. I think it'll help accrual. And I think it's going to be a compliance nightmare for compliance officers for a while because everything's going to be changing.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, so I agree with Kelly that the COVID pandemic forced the adoption of technology that many had been just considering or a little bit lukewarm on, virtual consenting or remote consenting, virtual visits, including telehealth, things like that was being talked about, but there weren't that many opportunities via studies from sponsors in order to actually implement it, or sites that were really willing to take that plunge in there. There was a small number, and this accelerated, shifted the curve, and it really forced the issue, and people have jumped in and realized it can work. The two aspects I think that'll really make a determination in terms of whether it's short term or becomes more of a permanent, is still to be felt, is one, will we get the next generation of protocols from sponsors? Will they have virtual visits baked in as the option instead of an option or a fallback? But will it be expected your 3 month, 6 month, 12 month, 18 month are all going to be virtual, and that's the only way to do it? That will continue to force the issue that we can do, remote visits. The other piece is how, and maybe there's already a solution, and I don't know, but how is investigational product delivered when you've got 100 patients scattered around the country? How do you get them their 2-week supply of study drug? Is it drone through Amazon, dropping it off at the doorstep? Does it have to be a specific courier that sponsor is paying for, and that specific training on handling? Again, I think you'll see rapid expansion of decentralized trials. But those are still pretty big obstacles because there's regulatory and legal considerations and just how to get investigational product into patients' hands safely and effectively.
It's interesting you talk about those two. I was talking to a site owner yesterday, and this is a shout out to Dan Safara. We just did that conversation yesterday. And he was talking about, well, how do you even get trust? In the end, patients come to sites because they trust the doctor, and they want to be part of the study because they trust the doctor. If you're going to tell the doctor that, you know what, you're going to get nothing out of this, we're just going to directly connect to patients, and we're going to go primarily remote, well, why is the doctor going to be part of this? And why is he going to suggest or recommend this to patients? And the second thing he raised is, if you have everyone go remote, going and seeing the CRA or going and talking to the doctor and finding out, and him asking you or her asking you, did you take the medication yesterday? And you going, crap, I forgot. That won't happen. And since that won't happen, your compliance may start getting affected. I thought those were some interesting, very practical, hands-on thoughts or considerations. I guess my question for you is, what does the future look like? And when I talked about that, the future looked like, we've asked this question 1,000 times and no one really knows. And I feel like every time I ask this question, we get a different answer because the future keeps changing. But when we are doing a clinical trial and we're trying to, we're saying that we're going to go towards remote monitoring, centralized monitoring, what do you think, what aspects of those will probably land up getting centralized versus not?
So your question is, what is going to be centralized first?
Yeah, sure. Instead of
Well, Geoff, you might disagree with me, but I think the centralized monitoring was already, I think, in play. I think it's going to become more, it has to become more evident right now because nobody is allowed on site for many of the sites. There's, they've got a vendor restriction with COVID.
Yeah.
So I think monitoring is definitely going to probably be kind of a priority first, because any study that's been done, they need to monitor. They can't just not monitor. And remote monitoring was on the radar. That was moving forward. I think the patient visits, I think Geoff's right. I think it'll be interesting to see if we start getting new studies with patient visits embedded into the trial that are optional, hybrid, on-site, virtual. But I think there's compliance issues. I think there are issues with patient trust, patient responsibility. There's a lot that goes on with that. And I think we're kind of at a crossroads with, do you trust a patient to not come back and see somebody? Do you? With some of these patients, they're older. They don't have help at home with them. For the young, 30-something-year-old, 40-something-year-old who's diagnosed with cancer and wants to continue to work, where we're headed is a great thing. But I'm not sure how fast it'll happen. Geoff may have a different idea.
This was actually inspired by a conversation we had just before we jumped on that Geoff hinted at, which is why I'm curious what his take is. Geoff, I'll sort of prod you a little bit. You talked about administrative functions going centralized first. And what was your This was actually inspired by a conversation we had just before we jumped on that Geoff hinted at, which is why I'm curious what his take is. Did I just get to hear my own voice?
I mean, I'm someone, I'm very much in agreement with
administrative
trying to
first. And this was actually inspired by a conversation we had just before. I'm not sure what happened there.
That's weird. Is Geoff having trouble?
Geoff, are you there?
I turned my, can you still hear me? I turned my camera off.
Yeah, there you go. You're better.
Can you hear?
Oh, now you're,
there we go.
you're
Okay. For whatever reason, if I turn my camera off, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you better now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there either. So to your question, we've had a lot of interest in the last 3-4 months around sites looking to centralize the administrative aspects of clinical trials research, where multiple hospitals spread out over a state that in the past would have, everything would just be routed locally and reviewed, and each hospital would negotiate, are now looking at opportunities for centralization to create more streamlined, because people are decentralized and they're learning that workflows and processes can continue to work with people working from home, which is expected to continue. So I think that's where looking at not only how centralized and structured environment to get the work done in a more efficient manner is being explored, as well as increasing levels of external partnerships or outsourcing of certain functions, which Kelly and WCG have both been involved with for a number of years, providing services to sites, as opposed to them hiring and maintaining staff internally that would do the work. And that is on the upswing. And I think as that administrative function continues to be explored, it's going to feed into the nature of change and the acceptance of a new type of clinical trials research being conducted by their investigators. So I think they go a little bit hand in hand, but definitely the business aspects and the business opportunities to stabilize and reduce some of the administrative costs of clinical trials research is definitely a driver from health systems, hospitals, even clinics, because a lot of that, the impact of the pandemic has been a lot of that extra revenue from certain service lines has been stripped away. And while research is typically a drop in the bucket for most hospitals, but now that bucket's much smaller, right? You can't afford to lose $1 million on research or invest into research when your gross profits have, really decreased tremendously in the last year to 18 months. So finding more cost-effective ways on the administrative side is, I think, pushing forward some of the change, pushing sites along the change curve, which is going to translate to how is pharmacy supporting research, how are clinicians supporting research, how are our staff, how is the monitoring, the business. I mean, all of that is going to be under the microscope, I think, which, Darshan, you've advocated for, Kelly, you've advocated for, a lot of people have said this is where research needs to go. This might be the opportunity for proactive sites to really say, let's see what we can do to really change the methodology by which we're conducting business to keep our research portfolio strong.
That's a really interesting angle, which is going after sort of what does the future state look like and sort of aiming towards that and making it work better. So let's ask that version of the question. What does the site of tomorrow look like? And how does the sponsor of tomorrow support that site better? So, Kelly?
I think it's really an interesting paradigm shift that's going on, because we have sites that are totally remote. Totally. Everybody's out of their home now. They have no idea they don't have a plan for everybody to be back in the office. And I think that we are going to see more people who are working from home doing clinical trial research, from the administrative oversight as centralized that Geoff and I, work in a lot, to, coordinators at home doing data entry that they could have done at the office. I think that there's going to be a new wave of remote entry into systems and a lot of scrutiny on, privacy and security. I just think there's so many things that could change over the next, few months. It'll be interesting to watch. I think we're on a pretty fast roller coaster right now. I mean, you've got to have something done with Medicare and how they changed how they flipped and had all of the things that they did with the statutes, and when they realized there were barriers and they did the blanket waivers. They're going to be going back and looking at all that. And I think people are going to be doing remote monitoring, self-monitoring, because there are going to be audits in that area, I think.
Already starting, actually. But you answered the question of how a site's going to be different. How can the sponsor support those sites? The sponsor of tomorrow support those sites to be that future state?
I think the number one thing they're going to have to be is flexible. I think they're going to have to accept, that sites are becoming more nimble. They're becoming, more adaptable, and the sites that are going to survive are the sites that meet the challenges that are coming and that have happened over the past few months. I think sites are. If we're doing everything remotely, you wonder if sponsors will start to go directly to sites for certain studies, because there are some types of studies that, it's data collection through mobile device. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a very interesting process to watch, and we'll see what happens. But I think sponsors and CROs are going to have to realize that these sites have made some very drastic changes, and they're going to have to work with them and be flexible, because some sites don't have an office anymore.
So what I hear you almost saying is a future version of the site could be without a CRO to sort of look over them.
I mean, who knows?
We're guessing, but I mean, it's an interesting sort of thought experiment.
I have a lot of friends who work at CROs. That's not my thought. I mean, that's not my want or desire. But as I said, some of these studies, if the data can be collected through a cell phone or a computer, and all of this can be done centralized, even from IRB prep, regulatory prep, budget, contract, consent, all of that. Where does the intersect of live or monitoring or oversight come in? Geoff, what do you think?
It's a great question, and I think you're right in that there's the readiness to accept change has been forced on everyone, and those that continue down that path probably going to have greater likelihood to succeed coming out. And there will be a bit of a push and pull, tug of war over, I think, between the roles of CROs and direct to sites. I mean, even pre-COVID, there were conferences and there were discussions about running siteless clinical trials, of being able to just have CROs or sponsors directly, of contacting, through a network of investigators, working with patients, not engaging with the academic medical centers or with the community hospitals, but going directly to flip it around and start saying, okay, so which sites that are willing to partner with sponsors directly can together by sponsors put together third-party services that are put together by sponsors that maybe in the past were coordinated or contracted by CROs to provide, whether it's monitoring or something like that. So I think that is potentially a little bit of conflict between CROs and sites now, because the sponsors will be there. They've got the investigational product, they've got the investment, and I think what we've seen, at least WCG has, a substantial part of its operations that work directly with pharma and certain aspects of our business that provide services to pharma as well. And there's definitely an acceptance and a willingness by a lot of the larger pharma to invest additional resources in, or they're willing to put money into, providing direct to sites, third-party services like genetic counseling or study advertising, contracting with third-party firms that can do the IT and infrastructure for remote consenting and enrollment, things like that. Sponsors are stepping up and willing to invest additional monies in right now. Will that continue? We'll see, but I think that puts a little bit of the CROs a little bit in the crosshairs in terms of, are they going to go against sites and allow, and kind of fight for that patient access, or are sites going to go, against the CROs and try and say, we don't need a CRO to contract and organize this, is, we've already got it set up, just we'll submit you an invoice every month. So it will be interesting, I think, how that dynamic plays between those two players in the research, infrastructure.
So let me switch the paradigm a little bit and go back to a point that was raised. We're talking about what future sites could look like. Here's a question: what does the future patient look like? And what I mean by that is there's been a huge push, as we know, to bring diversity into clinical research. And in the context of doing that, they want to bring more women, more female patients, more women in general, but more female patients. They also want to bring more minorities in there. Do you think that this push toward telehealth is going to enable that, or is it a non-factor? And we'll let let Kelly sort of start us off.
I think the patient of the future for clinical trials is going to be different. I think we're going to see patients who are much more savvy, and if you're able to do things through a virtual platform, there's going to be patients that are going to go on study without hesitation, because in the past they wouldn't go on because they had visits that they had to miss, picking up children or going to work. I think that part of the problem during the pandemic has been, the coverage for patients on clinical trials. And some of that stemmed from the fact that we flipped from IV medication to oral in some instances on trials because of not being able to go to clinic. Well, there's a disparity issue in drug coverage for seniors because of the Part D plans and how Medicare is set up. And there were patients that couldn't have drugs on trials, that dropped off of trials because of drug disparity. There needs to be drug parity in the country, where if a patient across the board wants to go on a trial, they don't have to have basically a penalty to do that. And I think those are the kind of things we're going to see changing over the next year or so. And patients are going to get more and more savvy about, well, I want to make sure that I have this covered. And patients are going to, want to see what they're going to be charged. And I mean, that's coming too. So I think the patients are going to be, more informed, which could be a good thing or a bad thing.
So what I'm hearing you say, Kelly, and I'm going to let Geoff go right after this, but the patients may look more diverse because they may be females, they may be minorities, but interestingly enough, you might get more of the sicker patients and more of the older patients coming on in because they don't have to make a trip to the doctor's office anymore. And the future patient is potentially better informed. Is that a nice summary?
That is. I think it depends on the age of the patient and their, honestly, tech savviness.
Yeah.
But the patient of tomorrow that's tech savvy between, 25 and 55, with the way we flipped and everything we've done is virtual the last 9 months.
Yeah.
Just think what that could do for clinical trial accrual and how the patient reacts to going on a trial.
Yeah. Jeffrey?
So I'm a bit more pessimistic in terms of the patient of the future. I think I was very optimistic back May, June that clinical trials research and clinical research was getting so much media attention and so much education and materials out there into the general public on how drugs were being studied to attack and to treat for COVID, and how vaccines were being developed. And I thought this could be a huge boost to the clinical research industry, where we have a more educated population and people more accepting of investigative therapies that can, they'd be willing to participate in. And unfortunately, I don't think that materialized. I'm disappointed by the percentage of people who say that they won't take a vaccine because it was rushed or because the research was done too fast. I'm disappointed by the number of people that are still even with a lot of the extra efforts that went into recruiting minority populations, that it took 2 or 3 versions of recruitment versions to try and get closer to the numbers that were being hoped for. And I think Kelly touched on it earlier, in that even if we go to a virtual care setting, telehealth or virtual care, I think that relationship between the patient and his or her physician still is what carries the day. And I think, having a physician with a relationship with that is presenting an opportunity to participate in the research for you or for your family member is going to drive those participation levels. I just unfortunately don't think there's enough of the general population that became woke to the value of clinical research and will, just altruistically look to participate the next time they have an illness, to see, are there clinical trials out there. I wish it was the other way. I love the work that CISCRP has done for years, trying to push the value of clinical trials research and participation in it. And I hope that, part of the work that was being done around COVID was going to help accelerate that and change the dynamics when we come out the backside of this. But between the people that are still resistant, between on drugs in terms of, are they effective? Are they not? Are we jumping into misinformation or information too quickly? Just kind of darkened my mood a little bit on it. So I think we're still going to rely on patient and his or her physician relation. And can they get connected to other physicians within that health system that are investigators for trials? And then the aspects and the technology around virtual care can help. But I don't see that. Unfortunately, I don't see that making a huge boost in study enrollments. And if we could affect study enrollments by even 10, 20%, we don't have to double it, but 10, 20%, it would help the economics of clinical research so much at the site level, at the sponsor level. But it's hard to move that needle. And I'm just still a little bit pessimistic that we a little bit missed on the opportunities that were happening during the pandemic. And we didn't get the benefit that potentially could have happened for the research industry.
Jeffrey, I'm going to give you one last try because we are well over what I thought we would be. So any last words, and how could people contact you if they have questions about engaging you?
Absolutely. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can always do a search for me on LinkedIn. Shoot me a message. Invite to connect. I have email address, first initial, last name, Schick at wcgclinical.com. I love the industry that I'm in, working with people like yourself and Kelly WIllenberg, the challenges of clinical research. I'm still optimistic that I think things will get better. I just wanted, we wanted some great fixes and have the golden age of research to come out of this. And it's not quite going to happen, but would love to, anyone that has an interest in talking further, would love to hear from you.
Kelly, your turn.
So you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at kelly@kellywillenberg.com, or I have a website called kellywillenberg.com. I just want to say that I echo what Geoff says. We're in a great industry and we've got so much opportunity right now. It's saddened me to see some people that we all know who have left the industry in the last 9 months. for a variety of reasons, furloughs, layoffs, jobs being eliminated. But it's an exciting time, and it where it goes from here. We can only imagine with what happened, what transpired, and then how patients react, how SMOs, CROs, and then how sponsors react. I think the sites are going to be the ones that have to figure a lot out, and that's where Geoff and I come in.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Thank you, both of you. Talk to you guys soon.
You're welcome. Bye, Geoff.
Bye now.